IVM.
Yuval Noah Harari said, "We are all living together on a single planet, which is threatened by our own actions. And if you don't have some kind of global cooperation, nationalism is just not on the right level to tackle the problems, whether it's climate change or whether it's technological disruption." Welcome to States of Anarchy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and I'm the host of the show. Every week, I break down important topics in global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. We know the environment is important. The effects of climate change are apparent to us, now more than ever. It is important that nations cooperate, but it's often difficult to achieve any kind of consensus on what this cooperation should look like. So, how does climate diplomacy work? How is it shaped by domestic factors? What approaches does India take? These are questions I put to my guest today. Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram is an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and co coordinator of the Center for Climate Studies at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Her latest book, Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies India as a Case Study, is about the international climate order. We'll get into the conversation with Dhanasree after a quick break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsor on the network this week, Credence. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by actress Shreya Pilgaonkar to talk about her career in acting. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi lists down the modern concepts of friendship and how one can choose the right friend circle in life on Begin the Journey. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor was joined by Aisha Bilamoria to talk about running and developing an athletic mentality. Farhad and Sunetra are joined by LGBTQ workplace advocate Suresh Ramdas to discuss the new normal in queer relationships on KBCD. On Tere Mere Raaste, Keshav Chaturvedi takes us to the riverbanks of Banaras and describes the soulful mornings to us. And finally, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, Chetna Chakravarti takes the fear out of the word responsibility. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Dhanasree. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Hamsini. Thank you for having me on your podcast and looking forward to the conversation.
So let's start right off. I know you've been working on sort of like climate change issues and how they relate to geopolitics for as long as I have worked in foreign policy for. So, what do we mean by climate diplomacy?
So climate diplomacy, to start with, has existed for a long period of time. It has existed since 80s and early 90s when the 1992 Rio summit happened in particular, and which led to the formation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And since then, we have seen that that the whole international community has been at least trying to come together to tackle this climate crisis. So, of course, in the beginning, it was not really called a crisis, but now increasingly we are calling it a crisis and an emergency in itself, right? So, diplomacy has always been at the center of trying to deal with this problem of climate change since the beginning. And how countries have evolved their positions on climate change is something that climate diplomacy tries to answer. And in particular, why and how climate change is at the center of foreign policy agenda of many countries in today's politics is something that is also part of how climate diplomacy is conceptualized. And another important area which is also part of climate diplomacy agenda is how does climate change affect peace and security. And this is, again, as you know, in international relations, this is something that has not been explored much in the past, and now increasingly you're seeing climate change being a part of security studies, being a part of international political economy, and so many other sub-disciplines of international relations itself. So, in that sense, climate diplomacy tries to answer these questions and also tries to see how countries balance their national interest with the need for international cooperation itself. Because, as you know, this is a global issue, and without multilateral cooperation, we cannot really find solutions to the problem of climate change.
That's very interesting. I remember this anecdote that when the first sort of international summits on climate change started to be convened, first was only scientists that were attending them. And then in 5 years, it was economists that were attending them. And in 5 years, it was politicians that were attending them. And I think that's sort of like that anecdote really captures this trajectory that climate change has taken in terms of priorities that states accord to foreign policy issues?
Yes, so I think that is also kind of dependent on how you frame climate change, right? So in the beginning, like you mentioned, it was more or less framed as a scientific issue, as an environmental problem that requires scientific diagnosis and solutions. So yes, scientists were a huge part of it, which is why the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, was at the center of trying to understand what is the cause of climate change, what can be the potential impacts of climate change, and what can be the solutions to tackle climate change. But eventually, you saw that the economists were trying to find answers because, in the end, any measures that you adopt to tackle climate change is going to have an impact on economy itself, and that is something that we have realized, especially with developing countries, which have always tried to frame this issue as an environment versus development concern, right? And as we have moved ahead, of course, climate diplomacy has started to engage with more actors. So it's no longer about epistemic communities or transnational networks of scientists and social scientists. It is also involving grassroots mobilizations and actors like students and children and other types of actors, which are no longer just the state itself, right? So today's climate diplomacy is very different from how it was seen during the 90s and even 2000s, where it was largely a state-centered agenda, although states were being supported by non-state actors. But with the Paris Agreement in particular, which was put in force in 2015, what you are seeing increasingly is that non-state actors and transnational actors are also part of the solution now in a much bigger way, in a more autonomous way, rather, to put it that way. So I think climate diplomacy in that way has evolved with more actors being engaged in the processes and negotiations, and with more solutions that are being suggested as a result of the inclusion of these varied actors.
I want to come to India specifically. How have some of these ideas and like what are approaches that people and maybe politicians within India are taking? Because I think maybe this is just my take on it, but I think India is one of the few places in the world where people are closely like tied into environmental issues and have a strong stance about them. Like when I was in China, I was just simply appalled by the amount of waste I was generating because I'd never like used that much plastic in my life. So that's something that I think like personally is something that happens in India. But how do you think these ideas have sort of evolved?
So yes, you are right when you say that India's positions on climate change have roots in how sustainability and environmental issues have always been part of the culture, if you look at it. So since ancient times, environmental sustainability has been a part and parcel of our approaches towards environmental sustainability or environmental conservation or even climate change, as you mentioned, right? But as we have moved ahead, what we are also seeing is that there is a huge change in that approach as well. So these ancient traditions or those values which you associate with Indian civilizational identity are no longer really as strong as it was, say, earlier. So, in that sense, what you will find is that with this modernity and all these different changes happening within societies and the demand for better lifestyles and you also find like manufacturing industries being expanded. In that sense, what you also find is that industrialization is catching up in India as well. So in that sense, yes, we have a lot of values that you associate with India's civilizational identity, which are typically very much adhering to the notions of sustainable development, environmental conservation, and all of that. But what you also find is that this kind of consumption that you typically associate with the developed countries, you would also find similar kind of trends in India as well. And this is something that we need to kind of avoid as much as we can, so as to not engulf ourselves with the kind of problems that many countries are already facing. And I think you took the example of plastic, and India is one of the largest producers of plastic waste today, irrespective of the fact that this is not part of our culture, if you look at it. So, yes, approaches towards climate change have also evolved that way. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, it was always seen as okay, first of all, it's a diplomatic issue that, okay, we need to deal with it at the international level. Secondly, it is also something that kind of also defines this environment versus development debate, that if we are doing something for the environment, it might be at the cost of development imperatives. And after all, our priority is to eradicate poverty and make sure that millions of people who do not have access to electricity have access to it. All these are the priorities right now. So if these are compromised upon, then of course this is not something that would any government for that matter in India would like to take upon. So in a way, these approaches have given way to newer approaches, which means that yes, development is important, but environmental conservation, which, as you said, it's something that has evolved and has been there in our culture, in our psyche for a really long period of time. It is part of our ethos. Why not revive them and help them go hand in hand with the development imperatives that we have? So it is not impossible to blend them both and make sure that people have access to development at the same time. Ecological services, which are so important for this kind of development to survive and sustain itself for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, particularly as sort of like newer technologies come up, which make sure that it is possible to sort of have development while also meeting your ecological needs in one sense. So let's come to sort of international negotiations in general. What approaches does the Indian government take to climate diplomacy? How has that changed, say, over the last 10 years?
Yeah, so in my book as well, this is in my book on climate diplomacy and emerging economies. This is what I have tried to look at is the shifts in climate diplomacy positions, especially between 2009 and 2019. So in that sense, India's positions have shifted, and there is definitely that shift. Although the major goalpost may not really shift much, and which has been always the case with India's foreign policy as well, that whichever government comes into picture, the larger objectives or the major goalposts won't change. It is just that the strategies and some tools and some methods may actually change in terms of how you achieve those goalposts in the end, right? So if you look at 2000s, what in my book also what I have written is the fact that with the financial crisis, which hit the major Western countries in a big way, did not affect countries like India and China as much. They were still growing pretty fast. Their GDP was still growing at a fast pace, so a fast pace. In that sense, what happened is there was a shift in the so-called world order itself, the global order, including the global climate order, where the realization came in that the developed countries are not going to act unless these major economies also come on board, especially China and India, and also Brazil and South Africa to a lesser extent. So, with that kind of shift in the global order itself, what you saw was that India also had to shift its climate diplomacy positions. So, yes, in the beginning, like I mentioned, it was first more like a diplomatic issue. Of course, then it started to be presented as an opportunity as well, maybe because this is an opportunity to enhance your international cooperation with other countries. This is also an opportunity to think of ways in which you can have more sustainable growth within the country, maybe put in place certain measures which would obviously reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because at that point in time, India's emissions, China's emissions were also growing pretty fast, and India had become the third largest emitter. If you discount the European Union, because the EU is the third largest, but then it is not one single country, right? So with all these changes, the pressure on India began to mount to act more on climate change. So, yes, it became an opportunity as well. And it became a case of international pressure to act more. And then, of course, with these kind of changes happening within the global order, as well as domestically with the climate vulnerabilities increasing, the Indian government, I mean, Indian establishment, and this is not just the case with the Manmohan Singh government, and then which was followed by the Narendra Modi government. Both these governments, what they have done is to look at opportunities for cooperation, by which India can achieve some of its targets, like especially in terms of energy, right? So renewable energy has become a cornerstone of India's climate policy. So in a sense, India's climate goals are tied to energy security goals as well. So this is a kind of co-benefits India was looking for, that it cannot be just climate protection or climate change. It has to be something that will also help the country develop. So in that sense, co-benefits was kind of an approach that India adopted. And this is a kind of policy change that also you saw India adopting at the international level, wherein it started to project itself as a responsible power. So this also goes hand in hand with this idea of India becoming a major power, rising power, which wants to put across this notion that India is a responsible country. Now it is part of the global high table. It wants to contribute norms to various international mechanisms and frameworks, which is why you saw India coming up with the idea of the International Solar Alliance also. And later, it also came up with the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So India came up with all these different ideas and frameworks which could help not just the country itself, but even other countries to cope with the problem of climate change. So slowly, India started to project itself as a responsible power and eventually, of course, a climate leader in itself, especially with the Trump administration and the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. It was an opportune moment for countries such as China and India to, I mean, I think China did it quite effectively in trying to show itself as a climate leader, filling the vacuum that the US left. But I think India also made quite a few efforts to do so. And I think it did leave a kind of a mark, at least in terms of stating very clearly, for instance, that it is the only country which is actually it is one of the only countries which is actually en route to achieving the target set under the Paris Agreement. For instance, if you compare it with the other countries, including the industrialized countries or China or other countries. So yes, there has been a shift in that sense. But if you look at it, India still talks about equity, justice. It talks about these concerns as well, that developed countries have to act more no matter what. They have to provide financial assistance to developing countries. In that sense, these kind of demands, it hasn't set aside, which was something that they have been carrying forward since 1992 itself. So some of these principles are red lines that it cannot compromise upon, but that red lines can be interpreted in different ways. And India has compromised on several issues to make sure that this multilateral forum of the Framework Convention on Climate Change works effectively for the better of the world.
That's a very interesting shift that sort of is in positions, right? Because earlier, at least on like how international organizations would frame it or other countries would frame it, is that India was sort of blocking progress on climate change. And then the narrative shifted, particularly with the US withdrawing from the Paris Accords, to India being sort of, as you put it, like a climate leader or a world leader on like climate change issues. And I think that shift is very important because not only does it open up opportunities, it also opens up things like technology transfer that India is very passionate about in I think particularly when we're talking about climate change commitments and things like that. And it makes me wonder, what are, you already spoke about some of the things like equity already, but like what are the main ideas that influence India's position whenever it goes to a negotiating table and whenever it's talking about climate change? What are the main ideas that influence it?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, so yes, ethical ideas have kind of dominated India's rhetoric, at least on climate change. Right from the beginning, India has been talking about equity. It has been talking about, that equal access to the carbon space, or rather, more like equitable access to carbon space, not equal. So, because I think the developed countries have already used up their space, and there is not much space for the developing countries. So, this is a question that has been raised by India quite a lot. Justice is another issue. Again, justice, which is more at the international level, that developing countries should have the ability to develop and ensure that their populations have access to the basic amenities at least. So this has dominated India's discourse on climate change, and even today, these are the kind of principles that India has not given up yet. So if you look at common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is one of the basic principles of the UNFCCC itself, and all the agreements that have been signed so far, whether it was the Kyoto Protocol or Paris Agreement, they all base or the foundational principle for all these agreements is CBDRRC. That is, the differentiation between developed and developing countries cannot be diluted, and developed countries have to provide or they have to act more, and they have to provide more financial and technological assistance to the developing countries. So this is one of the major ideas that has dominated India's positions on climate change internationally. But as you mentioned, connected to these are, of course, intervening variables like ideas about what does it mean to have development? What does it mean to have social justice? What do you mean by socio-economic development? And what are the kind of technologies that India wants? So India, for instance, is one of the few countries which recognizes nuclear energy as clean energy. A lot of European countries do not do that. Or many other countries are averse to the idea of nuclear energy as clean energy, right? But for India, it is clean energy. Similarly, what is development? So all these concerns have also dominated India's discourse on climate change. Apart from that, I think I mentioned this in earlier also about the civilizational identity. So I think this has been increasingly evoked, especially under the Narendra Modi government, with the kind of invocations about India's ancient Vedas and about India's ethos, which has talked about sustainability. So these are the kind of principles that India has adhered to for a long period of time and continues to do so even today. So this is a kind of rhetoric which has also come into play. So yes, factors like religion and culture, all these elements have also come into play. And then I think one of the most important parts is also about the ecological ideas, right? So as we have seen with time, India's own ecological vulnerabilities have increased. So whether it is in terms of the disasters that India is facing, the kind of damages that are being incurred on account of disasters, we still do not know the extent of damage because we are not even looking at externalities, for instance. So, with all these kind of vulnerabilities and India's own emissions growing at a fast pace, although our per capita emissions are low. So, per capita emissions may be low, but then if you look at aggregate emissions, it is quite high. So, in that respect, ecological ideas and our own knowledge production has increased over a period of time. And this has also helped us evolve our positions on climate change internationally because we can then talk about this issue much more confidently. Otherwise, you kind of depend on Western science and all of that. And then I think one of the important ideas which has come to dominate India's positions lately, in particular after 2009, is of course geopolitical ideas, right? So, what does it mean to be a responsible power? What does it mean to be a climate leader? And especially with India's own image of self-identification, right? That this is a country that needs to be in United Nations Security Council with a permanent seat and permanent veto power. And if that is the case, then that it can deliver more. It is a responsible country. So yes, with these kind of geopolitical shifts that you find at the international level, India's own image has also changed as well. So this has also had an impact on how India positions itself internationally. But of course, there are other factors like interest based explanations as well, because when you have China, for instance, which signed this cooperation or this joint communic agreement with the US just before the Paris Agreement, and how China also started developing closer partnership with the European Union. So with all these different kinds of changes, India also had to contribute more, right? So there are interest based explanations as well, and also about the ideational shifts as well. So yes, even today, I mean, just to leave you with this idea, like the recent kind of debates on net zero emissions as well, very clear that. So I just want to say that this is something that has not actually left India, this idea of spoiler. So yes, maybe over a period of time India is being seen as a constructive player, but even today you can see that India is being seen as this reluctant power which is not ready to declare a net zero emissions target, which China did very happily, just declare a target of 2060. Why is India not ready to do the same? So, in some sense, even before the Paris Agreement, India was seen as a problem by some Western countries. So, over a period of time, of course, India's image has improved and India is being seen as part of the solution and not part of the problem. But there are occasions when still that image of a spoiler comes up, when India is reluctant to succumb to some of these international pressures that come its way.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point that you're raising, Dhanasree, because definitely a lot of things have improved. And India also, maybe for a long time now, has seen itself as sort of like a moral power on many issues, right? Not just climate change. But of course, some of its actions don't necessarily, like other countries might perceive it as not necessarily it walking the talk. And it makes me think about, when we're thinking about the future, in your book, you spoke about the basic countries, right? Like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And now, when I consider the current situation of the world, where all of these countries have much slower economic development than they did in the 2000s, when all of them were like, oh, this is the era of multilateralism, you're going to have a lot more middle powers. So, do you think that this is going to influence not just India, but a lot more developing countries' positions, particularly on climate change?
Yeah, so you are right when you say that this is something that is going to affect almost all economies, particularly developing countries. So the emergence of basic during 2008, 2009 was a critical time in itself because, as I mentioned, there was international pressure on all these countries to act more, and these countries found it appropriate to come together to thwart that pressure, because that is the only way you can counteract the pressure coming from the developed countries. In today's world, that kind of solidarity is not being seen among developing countries in the first place. So all these countries are going their own way. So China has chosen its own path, and I don't really call China a developing country anymore. I think they are well past all the other developing countries in terms of their economy and technology, especially, right? So, if you look at Brazil, South Africa, they have gone their own way on climate change and they want to find their own path on this issue. They do not really cooperate with all the developing countries, except when it comes to bilateral or minilateral cooperation that you find not in the negotiation space. But you will find a group like minded developing countries, which includes actually China, India, and a few other countries like Indonesia and others. So, all these countries which were developing until recently. And now with COVID 19, of course, most of these countries are in a deep economic slowdown. You will find that almost all countries are going through this problem. So, how is this going to impact their climate change positions will be a matter of concern. And that is why, you would find that with the COVID-19 pandemic, and if you look at India's positions also in this particular year, you can see that there has been a slow, a kind of a slowdown on what kind of commitments we are going to make on climate change, at least. And yes, on renewable energy, we are still going strong. And I think that is an important sign to show that renewable energy is going to be the center point for climate cooperation for India, at least at the international level. And this is going to be that bargaining chip that India would continue to use at the international level. But if you look at other areas, there is still lacuna as far as climate diplomacy is concerned. So renewable energy is not going to be the only solution, right? So yes, there are other areas of cooperation being spoken about, like green hydrogen. So all these are going to transform the energy sector, basically, right? What about the other sectors which are also heavily impacted by climate change? So here in developing countries are going to have a major problem in terms of finding financial resources to cope with climate change. So, mitigation, adaptation, all these are different pillars of climate change which require humongous amount of financial resources. And where is it going to come from is a huge question mark. So, you cannot really depend on developed countries to give you money. And that is why there is also a lot of talk about mobilizing private capital today. So, yes, the money is going to come from private sources, and that is where all the attention is now being paid to. And this is the kind of shift in discussions that are happening at the international level today. And especially with the developing countries, which need that source of finance from different parts of the world.
Definitely. I think climate financing is going to be even bigger than it is now. And since we're talking about the international stage on one hand, I wonder within the domestic sphere, what are domestic concerns about climate and climate diplomacy? I think one of the things that I really enjoyed in your book was you sort of had this table that talked about how there were three different groups that had different perceptions about climate change and diplomacy. And I think one was sort of people who stonewallers who focused on growth first. There were progressive realists and progressive internationalists. And I thought this was a very sort of effective way in looking at how different people perceive sort of climate change and diplomacy negotiations in that sense.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And that's, I think, one of the questions I tried to answer in my book, as well as to how domestic setting, how does it impact climate diplomacy, or does it have any interconnectedness at all? Because a lot of scholars would say that India's domestic requirements are kind of disconnected from how India projects itself at the international level. And I think there is a lot of merit to that argument as well, to a large extent. But I mean, in my book, at least, what I have tried to see is that yes, there may not be direct kind of connection in many cases, but indirectly there is. Like you mentioned about India's moral standpoint on foreign policy, right? I think this is also something that impacts India on climate diplomacy also, and that has a lot to do with what is going on at the domestic level, right? So for instance, India's moral standpoint comes from the fact that India will only commit to something that it can actually implement on the ground. So that is why there is a lot of focus on renewable energy, but not other targets like net zero emissions, which I think the establishment and the authorities know that this is going to be very difficult to implement, right? So at the domestic level, because the domestic imperatives have a lot more reformation to go through to make sure that they are going to be more climate sensitive. So we are talking about a few sectors, but climate change is a structural issue. This requires major overhaul of the structure itself, of policies itself. We are talking about a major overhaul in development planning. You're talking about overhauling trade, commerce, like you're talking about agricultural policies. All these different sectors require reforms to make sure that they're going to be more climate friendly or climate sensitive in nature, because all these sectors are affected by climate change in one way or the other, right? So when you say, yes, there is a huge domestic audience, and I think I might be able to take the example of once again the net zero emissions here to show you how divided this domestic constituency is on net zero emissions. While some would say that this is not a debate of environment versus development, by declaring something like net zero emissions, you can actually invite more investments into the country, because in the future it is entirely possible that countries would only invest in your country if you have a target. For instance, what if countries start talking about that? What if they say this is a precondition for it? So in that sense, this may be the opportunity for India to declare a target and invite more investments into the country. While others would say, are we actually prepared for that? Do we have the institutions to put in place or to achieve such a target? Can we actually transform or diversify the economies of so many different states in India, which are completely dependent on the revenues generated from coal production and electrification? So with all these different concerns, and of course we are also talking about just transition, but only lately. So we are talking about energy transition, but how to make that transition more just in nature, wherein the people who are dependent on the coal sector will not be jobless or unemployed after they transition to something completely different, right? So all these concerns are inherent to understanding why and how India will also position itself internationally. So, on the one hand, yes, you have people who would say that growth first is very important strategy, because otherwise we would be in this low development trap, and we would never be able to pull many people out of poverty that we have been able to in the past couple of decades. And if you're going into this major climate pathways, and if you're going to have a net zero emissions trajectory, this would mean that many people would still remain poor. So this is the kind of argument that some people would make it. Others would say that no, it would actually create more jobs. So that is where the progressive realists would come in, who say that no, this would create more green jobs. A lot of people who could not be employed by the coal sector or other sectors which are energy intensive will be employed by this clean energy sectors, and that would be a good transition, not just in terms of economy, but also in terms of health, for instance. So public health would improve. So that is what progressive realists would say. And then you have internationalists as well, who say that the domestic, whatever we do domestically has to be linked to the international level. So we are doing a lot of good work, and we also need to transform our economy and society and other parts of the system itself, which would make sure that our low carbon transition will not affect people in a really negative way. So these are the issues that will constantly come up in the discussions on climate diplomacy as well. And unlike many other countries which go ahead and declare targets without the consent of the people itself, I think there is I find that at least on climate change related issues, although it is highly elitist, I would say still it is very centralized with the prime minister's office at the helm of affairs. But I think with all these discussions happening at the local level, you would find that the Indian government, which was actually, I think it was almost ready to declare a target, but did not do so because of this kind of backlash you will find from many corners within the country itself.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like I call it like an environmental consciousness, because you see a lot of protests happening these days, happening particularly in rural India over sort of environmental standards, whether it's like Sterlite or Kudankulam or concerns from local residents, right? And I think like top down approaches, particularly in a country that's as vibrant a democracy as ours is, it's always difficult to take decisions as major as this one, because it would take very little for us to declare a target, right? Like declare it, say we are going to be zero emissions. But sort of like the legitimacy of our commitment to that target, I think would be something that we'll have to then really look at.
Yes, so that's why I said I think India has been one of these countries which has always been concerned about the legitimacy part. That if we are declaring a target, we should be able to achieve it. That is one of the concerns that all the governments have had. So, which is why any target you would find, you would actually find them not so ambitious. That we kind of declare the low hanging fruits. We usually go for them because it's doable. So, let's not call for something that is probably not doable in the time period or in that stipulated timeline that we are looking at. So, in that sense, yes, this is the legitimacy of the targets itself is very important. And I think this is an important message. It's not just about India, but I think this is a message that should go out to the rest of the world also, that it's great that all of you are declaring targets. But then targets are not good enough if you're not going to back it up with important changes within the system, especially in the short and medium terms, because these targets are essentially long term. They're going to need a lot of changes to be brought into the system at a much early stage. But what are these countries going to do in the next 1 decade or 2 decades is a very important question that we need to ask, because that is where a large part of this climate crisis is going to be addressed, because we can't be holding everything to say what 10 years or 20 years down the line. Actually, a lot of promises that are being made are all long term, whether it is transnational corporations or you look at these big giants, energy giants, or investment banks or financial institutions. They are all making promises, but they are all looking at the long term, because in the short term there are still going to be investments in coal. There are still going to be investments in fossil fuel projects, which are going to add to the climate change. So, in that sense, what is going to happen in the next 2 decades is something that is really important to discuss and not to get completely carried away by these long term targets. And I think we have to kind of shift from the target based approach to something that also holds countries accountable. We have never had a system in place which would hold countries accountable to these so called targets or whatever promises are made. And I think we have seen that with the failure of Kyoto Protocol, for instance, to make these countries, especially developed countries, accountable. A lot of developed countries did not even live up to their promises. So when you have a system which is not making countries accountable enough for their actions, then what is the point of having these long term targets, right? So, yes, on the one hand, you need accountability in the system. On the other hand, like I mentioned, it is very clear that what would happen in the next 2 decades is very important to how climate change or climate crisis is going to evolve. And therefore, India also needs to push for more transparency on what is going to happen in the short term.
Yeah, I think those are very important points that you've raised, because some of, I think, the poorest states in India, for example, are ones that produce electricity, mine coal, etc. And this is true not only for India, but countries around the world. And I'm wondering, are countries and non-governmental organizations issuing targets because of global public pressure? Is it just sort of a signal, or is it sort of a symbolic move to say, yeah, this is what we're going to do? But when your targets are 50 years away, no one's going to question what you're doing this year or next year, right?
Yeah, so I think there is already a change in mood there. So I think people, yes, there is that, like you mentioned, there is clearly and this pressure, right? So even on India, there is a great amount of international pressure today to declare a target no matter what. So then does India declare, say, 2070 as a target? Because, okay, China has decided to declare 2060. So if China is saying 2060, then it's probably fair to say India can do so by 2070. Or should it actually just say 2050, unlike China? And then, play that game, the geopolitical game where you say that you're going to be better than China. So these are turning out to be largely geopolitical games as well, and where international pressure is increasing on all countries to declare such targets. And the issue here is that there's not much being asked about what will be done, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention also, right? What will be done in the next 10 years is going to be a problem as well. So many countries, developing countries, are also declaring targets, or they are mulling over what year should be the target year for them. So this has become like a global phenomenon. Now it's like a norm which has become universalized. So those who don't adopt such targets will be considered like a pariah state which has not come up with a target. It's not adhering to the new founded international norm for acting on climate change. So yes, and for India also, it makes sense to declare a target for, especially for international consumption, that a lot of policies are actually declared in that way to make sure that internationally you are on the safe front, that at least you won't be considered part of the problem, right? So that image, and it's like a symbolic move itself for many countries to make sure that you have a target, and then slowly you can make your way to it, like, so EU or other countries, US may declare one as well very soon. So all these countries have targets which, as I mentioned, like, you take the example of EU, and many countries within EU, like Poland, for instance, is coal intensive. And, when are they going to phase out coal entirely? Many countries within Europe are still dependent on coal for their economic growth. So it is not going to be very easy for much of these states to do that. But yes, EU has more money to make sure that the transition occurs. But that is not the same case with many other countries, like in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, which still invest in coal. So they haven't left coal. So yes, it is going to be difficult for these countries to, yes, they may declare one, like you take the example of South Africa, which has declared a net zero emissions target, but they have also made sure that they are going to back it up with just transition policies and other policies that will be required for a country that is so heavily dependent on the coal sector, right? And it also realizes that it is not just a matter of climate change, it is also a matter of trying to make sure that their country also diversifies their energy basket for the good, for the better of the people itself. So that kind of change will take a longer time, and that, as I mentioned, with this kind of targets, yes, you may be able to change the system a bit. You may be able to bring in policy and institutional changes that may also bring you to a low carbon pathway. But if it happens at the cost of, say, access to basic amenities, then we have to rethink on what is the model that we would like to adopt to deal with climate change. So some of these measures are very stopgap, or something that is just trying to delay. It's like a delay tactic itself, that yeah, I have done something, to say that, yeah, 2050 is the year by which we would just neutralize carbon emissions. But would that be enough is a huge question mark.
And I'm just wondering, from a realist perspective, one of the things that we spoke about was the need for accountability. But do you think there's actually a real possibility that we can ensure accountability in these kind of targets, particularly on the international stage, where most countries would rather, pass the buck than make realistic changes themselves?
Yeah, that is a very important question, because just from the past experience in the climate order, you saw that when Canada, for instance, when it could not achieve the targets under the Kyoto Protocol, yeah, it was not, the compliance mechanism existed within the Kyoto Protocol, but there was no attempt to make Canada accountable at all. They just decided that they would not sign on to the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, so that they don't have to be held accountable at all. And then they said that until the other major economies also come on board, we are not going to sign the next treaty, which came in the form of Paris Agreement. And it became like a bottom-up approach, wherein countries would come up with their own targets, and they would just submit them to the UNFCCC instead of a top-down timetables-based system like the Kyoto Protocol, which imposed targets on different countries. So, in that sense, compliance mechanisms have failed. And I think it's the same situation with Paris Agreement also, that if the US could simply pull out of the Paris Agreement after signing and ratifying it, how is it going? I mean, after signing Paris Agreement, when they pulled out of it during the Trump administration, very clearly it shows that these agreements are still susceptible to political changes within the countries themselves. So if you have a prime minister or president who doesn't care about climate change, then how do you make sure that they would actually adhere to these international norms? It would be very difficult to do so. Right now, the mood is upbeat. Yes, most of the countries are thinking of ways in which climate change can be tackled. But if you look at some of the countries are still very conservative about their approach. If you look at Bolsonaro, for instance, Brazil has been actually going in the reverse direction with respect to climate action. So yes, on the world stage, he still says, yes, we are part of the climate solutions. We want to be part of the solution. But if you look at how Brazil has been at the forefront of this whole debate on the market mechanisms. So if you look at the clean development mechanism, which was introduced under the Kyoto Protocol to make sure that these developed countries are able to achieve their targets by giving financial assistance to developing countries to develop their own renewable energy potential or other green projects, for instance. So the cheap credits, which still exist in the market today, the cheap carbon credits that still exist in the market, Brazil doesn't want to give up those cheap credits, whereas most other countries within the EU and least developed countries, island countries, they don't want them anymore because essentially they will allow these countries to emit more. So these kind of problems still exist in the system itself, which are going to be very difficult to deal with because many countries are still looking after their own interests. You look at the OPEC countries are still reluctant to major changes within the climate regime because major changes would mean that they would not be able to export oil and gas or to countries because some of these economies, you have to keep in mind that these economies are completely dependent on fossil fuels. So the moment you shift to something cleaner, it's not going to be easy for these countries to survive. So in that sense, there are different interests which are inherent to how the climate regime functions, and it is going to lead to more delay in action itself. So I don't think everything is rosy right now. That yes, because just because the mood is upbeat and the US is back on table doesn't mean that climate action is going to be accelerated. On the other hand, what I feel is that with the COVID-19 pandemic hitting all economies in a bad way, this is also going to reflect on how countries are going to recover from this kind of economic crisis, and if they're going to do it by burning more fossil fuels or by in a green manner is something that we have to watch out for as well, because the easy way out may be actually burning more fossil fuels. But if we have seen the precedents, it's very clear that if we really care about public health and if we really care about environment and human security, then I think it's important that we have a green recovery from this ongoing crisis.
You've given us a lot to sort of mull over, Dhanasree. This is my last question for you. What books or resources would you recommend for anyone who's interested more in climate diplomacy or in reading about climate change negotiations?
So there are a lot of books and resources on this. So if you want to read more about India's perspective on climate change, I think one of the leading academics who has written a lot on this is Navroz Dubash from Center for Policy Research, and he runs an entire team there who write on various issues concerning climate diplomacy. Lavanya Rajamani is another person who has written about these issues as well. I would also recommend reports published by World Resources Institute, Center for Science and Environment, the Energy and Resources Institute. So, all these different institutes have also come up with various reports. I would also recommend social scientists such as Sujata Bhairavan, who has talked about climate change, especially from a global south perspective, in a big way. And if you want to typically also, kind of understand the energy transitions in particular. There are other authors like Lydia Powell from the Observer Research Foundation, who's also written a lot. So this is more about India, but if you look at the global level, international level, there are plenty of books on this, and I don't really have to. I mean, it's just the list just goes on. So there's Matthew Patterson, Simon Dalby. Then there is, Climate Diplomacy is another website which is run by Adelphi, which has a lot of material as well on how climate diplomacy works at the international level. Yeah, so you have plenty of authors and reports and books which are there on the subject, and that is a good sign, I would say, because I think in today's world, this is an issue that clearly impinges on international relations, and we need more engagement with these kind of topics in international relations, because otherwise, if everything is going to be about a realist idea of world, I don't know where the world is headed. So yeah.
I completely agree with you, Dhanasree. I think we need to sort of look at all the different parts of the world rather than just take sort of a realist top-down approach of international relations. On that note, thank you so much, Dhanasree, for joining us today. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and best of luck with all of your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also enjoyed the conversation a lot, and I hope to have more such conversations with you. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Just a reminder that every fortnight I do a special Q&A episode where I take listener questions on global affairs. So if you have a question about climate diplomacy, or if you have any other comments or doubts, you can email me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com or get in touch on social media. On Instagram, my handle is @statesofanarchy, and on Twitter, I'm at Hamsini H. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, I'd love your support. Please share it with someone who may enjoy it, or leave us a rating. If you're not following us on Instagram, you should. We post quizzes, videos, and fun posts about the world. You can listen to States of Anarchy on any podcast app you use. Finally, I know Indian cities are opening up, but it's good to stay safe. So mask up, get vaccinated, and stay home. Sending you lots of good vibes. We'll be back next week.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset and everything sport.
So tune in to The Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators and change makers from across business, media, marketing and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app or wherever you get your podcast from.